Mixing with my plugin of the week is the Relab development LX480 Reverb. This is not a new plugin. It's been around for a bit, but it really harkens back to a reverb that was really an industry standard when it came out in 1986, and that's the Lexicon 480L. Just to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, because that graphic user interface there looks strikingly similar to this, the LARC, LARC, and that was standard for Lexicon Alphanumeric Remote Control. So this is how you would change programs and set up all the parameters. This is the actual hardware unit. So you'd get a cable which would connect you from here to this, and this would usually be put in some separate room, machine room, because it had a fan in it. Not that the fan was loud, it was a quiet fan, but it still would make some noise. But they made the cable long enough that you could get it out of the way and into some other location where all the processing would take place. And this would give you all the logical controls that you need to change the programs and all the parameters accordingly. And what it had was two primary processor boards that dealt with all of the reverb algorithms and crunching them. You have input output level controls and all the power supplies and all the logical control for getting the signals in and out. An incredibly smart system, and it sort of extends from a history of Lexicon, which dates back to the late 60s when they first started making digital gear, and some of the early digital delays, the Delta T. 101 and 102 were early delay systems. And the delay wasn't that much, but at that time, the processor chips that were used for that were quite expensive. And then what you may have seen also was the 224. The 224 was the first evolution of this basic model emulated by Universal Audio. That's one of the big emulations that's out there that's really good. And they came out, that came out in 71, and then oh, no, I'm sorry. That came out in 79. And then a short time later, the 224 XL, which was really the closest thing to what this is, came out. And this is basically a double processor version of that. So where that was a single reverb, this would actually give you two machines. And this came out in 86. And a few years later, they came out with the 960L, which was basically, I don't know, 4 or 8 processor board version of this, which gave you that much more processing power. What was unique about this, and the most important thing, was the algorithms that were used and the energy and effort that was gone into making an amazing digital reverb. It wasn't the first digital reverb that was out there. Probably one of the first commercial ones was the EMT 250, which is also an amazing sounding reverb. That was an 8-bit reverb. This is an 18-bit digital reverb that works at either 44.1 or 48 kilohertz. This had digital inputs and outputs, as well as 2 analog in and 4 analog outputs. And essentially what you would have is you'd have 2 machines. So you could have 2 separate reverb units. And this is the way most studios would set it up. When this came out, it was a very expensive reverb. Something on the order, from what I remember at that time, was over $20,000. And that's in the mid 80s. For a digital reverb. Really super high end. You could stack these processors, have the one single LARC control more than 1 unit, 4 units, 6 units, so they could be added onto. And this became the industry standard in terms of reverb. It's really amazing. So when we go back to what Relab has done with this, is they went in, and I'm not sure exactly how they did it. As far as I understand, it's not an impulse response technology the way that many of these other emulations are. So I'm not sure how they actually have the original algorithms, or I'm misunderstanding how the plugin is actually designed. But they have really incredibly well captured the sonic characteristics of working with the 480L. And it's a unit that quite so often I go into particular things and it's like, oh, I wish I had the small and bright program for these drums. And so I stumbled across this again, and then started to play around with it and realized how good it was and how much it really captured the essence of what I remember of the 480L. So an amazing unit. So the way that it works, and it's slightly different, has a bigger up front display here instead of the numeric keypads, and some of the basic setup for programs and registers. They just give you a bigger display, and it also gives the ability to change around some of the different settings, like in this case, the reverb volume, the pre-delay, the reverb time, and stuff from a graphic display. It gives you menus that you can kind of work from for changing a lot of the parameters. And normally the way that the 480L would work is you would have a page button. It would page usually through about 4 pages of parameters, and you would have these sliders that would allow you to adjust the parameters. If you hit one of the buttons down at the bottom, it would display full screen size what the parameter you were adjusting was, and then allow you to make adjustments for it. So that's kind of the very basics of it. So it doesn't matter what those original buttons were, but what they've done here is they've taken those different layers and they've mapped them out to these individual keys. So the quick key is something that you could program that gives the basic settings, reverb time, all that sort of stuff. But then you get more individualized settings here for reverb time. That shows up here in the time frequency, where you have 2 crossover points and 3 different areas where you could set reverb time. So you could have more low-end reverb, more high-end reverb, or less high-end reverb, which is a little more typical. And you get the high crossover, the low crossover, and then you get the basic multipliers for the reverb time. So the main reverb time, whatever that says, if it's 650 milliseconds, what happens is that if it's 0.8, it's 0.8 times that for low frequencies below 623 hertz, etc. And so you could see how that basically works. So each of these different things allow you to set the shape of the sound, high pass and low pass filters, modulation, density or diffusion. So they have some decay optimizations things here, which are quite cool. Early reflections. So it has up to 6 delay taps that come in. Now it takes the original signal, but these delay taps are not like singular delays. That's not the way Lexicon designed it. They're actually clusters of sound, which is more the way that sound reflects off of surfaces. So that the true early reflections and the way that they're quite often programmed into reverbs is not really accurate to what happens. So the idea is that when a sound wave hits a wall and bounces back to the source, it takes a certain amount of time to come back, but it doesn't come back as a singular slap. It comes back as diffused energy that's also colored. And that's kind of the way that they set it up, which makes it more natural sounding. So that's part of what makes, one of the many things that makes the 480L so insane, because the processing is intense and they designed something that can handle the amount of processing. And this was a very difficult thing to do going back to the 80s. And then the early reflection levels for those delays. So you get different parameters here where you have the delays. You could see the scale here in milliseconds and the gain. So you could control it from a singular display, deal with the reverb time, and high pass filters and all that stuff. So many of the display stuff you can get to right here, and then you could dig into deeper parameters here. Now, the way that this works, and they have not emulated every parameter here, that if you hit the load button here, what you do is you'll open up the presets. And so these are the presets from, I don't know, like a good 10 or 11 of the banks that came with the 480L. There were many expansions and things that were done. I think there were up to like about, I think it was close to 20 banks of programs that were done here. So they didn't do all of them, but they did up to a particular firmware version. It was like a firmware version 4.1 or something like that. But what you do is you get these programs that you can load up, and it gives you all the full characteristic elements of it. So you can load everything here from, ambience, halls, plates. There's some stuff that was for post-production here, which is more, like living room, car interior, that type of stuff. Halls. There was a random hall expansion that came in. Random spaces, which is another one. Rooms. Twin delays, wild spaces. There was mastering. There was a whole bunch of stuff that was in here, even a sample engine that was kind of built into it. And within this, beyond that, they also created a PCM. Their first, I believe, was a PCM 60, and which was meant to be like a quicker use version, single rack mount, simpler type of thing. Nothing like the 480L. But the later versions, PCM 91 and all of that, started to get, a lot of the similar algorithms. So some of that stuff has been loaded in here, as well as some presets from Chuck Zwicky and Shy. So you load up the parameter there. Once you select it and you load it in, it comes up here, and then you can adjust the parameters from it. Now, there are two basic programs that you can store in, A or B. So depending upon the configuration that you could set up, you can get into some of the, use this as a simple A/B, or you could have it configured so that one engine feeds into the other. And there's a few options, which I'll show you kind of in a little bit. So one thing I'm going to do is just kind of play you a few things, and then we'll get into some of the options and some of the details of it, but just kind of give you an idea of what it's all about. So what I have here is just drums set up right now. I have two things on here. I have one Lex that has a small and bright, which is one of my favorite programs here, and then I have a snare plate here from the 480L as the reverb on the plate. So they show up on these two faders, and I'll just kind of show you what that's all about. So you can see just the combination of the two there. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to close the plate and just want to show you a couple of variations on this with the drums. So what we have here, as I said, is the small and bright. I'm just going to go over to the B parameter here and load in a couple of other options. So like a couple of other ones, one I just saw, it just flashed before me. Brick Wall is also a very good one. Like a lot of these Wild Spaces ones work really well for drums. So I'm just going to double click on that, open that up. Kind of playing around with this thing, and I'll get into some of the parameters and kind of play around with this. The Brick Wall has like a little bit of a kind of slap back effect, but has this really big, rich, deep kind of sound. So let me just kind of load in a couple of others, and I'll get in. Also from the Wild Spaces, there's a couple of really good ones. Metallica is another good one. Right, so you get that real big, but a very natural, like open, big kind of space that you can really reach into. Let's just take a quick look here. I'll just kind of zoom out into a few other things. I'm trying to pick some spaces that might be more like go-to settings that it might have for drums in particular. Large chamber is another good one. But you could they just open up and they just sound amazing like straight away, which is really the great part of it. I just grab one other one. This also, you can get into some. This is kind of an interesting one, the Inside Out one, which will give you. It's more of an effecty kind of reverb. not really particularly suited for this, but you get the kind of vibe there. And so there's a lot of things that vary in terms of how they would work, in a particular mixed situation, and the way that you kind of lay them in. There was also a gated one. That's a gated ambience. This is one. This is a little bit more like a shorter, tighter reverb, probably something a little bit more along the lines of what you might get out of a AMS RMX or something. So just so you know, this is like in the studio world, working on a 480L, this was more of like your premium reverb unit. What was great about the 480L is that it had two engines. So most of the time people would set up for two mono inputs and two stereo outputs. So you'd have two high-end reverbs, and at least one of them would be for the vocal, and usually the other was for the drums. So most of what I demonstrate here is just to show you, just like very quickly by loading a few presets, how you can get just like very quickly like a very natural, amazing sounding space that work, and it's just a matter of the situation. There's some other features that are kind of built in here. You can go to previous next, which will toggle through some of the variations. It doesn't go into the different folders, so it'll stay within a singular folder once you set something up. But you could do it that way. If you find things that you like, you can save them as registers. So if you make individual settings, you can save those as well, and those will you can load up for other sessions and stuff if you find things that you fundamentally like. All right, so I'm going to move on from this a little bit and then get into some of the other features and focus a little bit more on the vocals. So let me kind of open this whole thing up here, and then slide over here to the lead vocal track and kind of get onto a couple things. So this way I can kind of show off some of the other aspects of this. So what I have here, and let me zoom in. What I have here is just a small hall, and set up for a small hall and stage. This is a one that I really liked. And we'll go through a little bit more and tweak some of the parameters here just so I can show you some of the things. The things you need to know about this is that the parameters that become available here are different based on the program, so they're not all identical. So you may open up the time menu on one, or the shape menu, and have like no parameters, or just one or two parameters. So not everything shows up in every situation, just so you know. There's also a lot of additional features that sort of get added on into this in the way that you use it. This shows up in the setup menu. So if we go back to the main page here, we select a configuration. So in this configuration, the way this is set up right now, this is in a cascade configuration. So what I have is the stereo into the A engine, that feeds into the B engine, and that feeds to an output. Okay, so I'm going to explain that. Whereas if I have this here, so I could set up two separate programs. The output of one feeds into the other, and then there are separate wet-dry controls for each one, so I can balance that out in terms of combining the effects. There's also the standard stereo in, stereo out main configuration, or single configuration. There is this left-right configuration. It doesn't have them listed here, and I'm not remembering them off the time, the exact names, but left feeds into A, right feeds into B, and then the stereo outputs get mixed together. And then there is one where the left and right feed into both the A and the B engine. So it's a variation on this, and then the outputs get mixed together. So that you get left and from each engine, right from each engine. So that allows you to create you could even have identical programs set up here between the two for left and right, but do some variations between the two sides and kind of create some different, sonic landscapes that way. Most of the way that this was used, these configurations didn't exist as much in the original hardware, because the original hardware had 4 outputs. So if you did mono in, they would do like what they would call mono split. You feed the left into A, the right input into B. They each would have separate stereo outputs that would feed 4 separate outputs, so you could isolate the reverbs. Let's go back to this one here with this configuration. So what I have here, and I'll come back to the setup because there's more stuff in there. a small and stage reverb program, and then on the B side, what I have is a program called Panorama, which is like a binaural thing, which helps to give a little bit of surround spreading kind of effect. So let's listen to this.
You went your way, and I went mine. Rolling down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by. And all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
So just so you get an idea of what the originals are like, I can switch to the single configuration. Switch out of here, and this is the Small Hall just isolated on its own.
You went your way, and I went mine.
This is just the Panorama program. Just so you could hear, it's going to sound just very phasey.
You went your way, and I went mine.
Okay, so when you put that on top of the reverb, then it has a more interesting effect. So let me go back to the configuration here.
You went your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by. And all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
So that's kind of the effect of sort of spreading the reverb, making it kind of come out of the speaker toward you a little bit more rather than setting behind. The cool thing, there's so many cool things about this and the way that it's configured. And with the quick menu, you can actually kind of set this up. So if you go to the setup page here, what you can do is you can set up on the quick page each individual fader. So there are, I don't know, 6 different categories that you can select from, 7 different categories you can select from. And then when you select from that category, you could decide which option from those are available, and that's what would open up on this page. So this way, if you wanted to work with particular parameters in the quick setup, ones that you get to the most or the quickest, like the size or the reverb time, then you would work with, and the pre-delay. Those are like some of the basic options. Also a width option here. You want to have those on the quick menu, and if you want to get into more detailing, then you can go into the individual categories and adjust them. Some of those are duplicated from what was in they're all duplicated from the quick menu in these other layers. But everything from diffusion, this is amazing, like some of the decay optimization type of stuff where it changes or creates some variation in the reverb, but based on the input signal as it comes in. Then you have just the reverb level output, the mix, wet, dry, control over the early reflections and the early reflection level. All those things are just give you an incredible amount of detailed control. Just since we're here, there's a couple other things here where you could change the display, the color of the display, saturation, and all of that sort of stuff. You can also set up a reflection in there, which there's a little bit of. You can see your face in there or something, I guess. You could just set up the graphic setup page to have a certain look to it, all of that sort of thing. There is actually one other page that yes, the digital noise. There's also some noise characteristic or some unique characteristics which are inherent in the original unit, which can be brought in there. So you can actually bring in some of the analog style noise that's inherent, and there is a bit of saturation that occurs in that. So you could bring in just the saturation characteristics. If you want a little bit of that without the noise, you could have it with the noise, and there were a couple different options that were there. But it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of the way that you use it. Let's just go through just in the simple setup here some of the basic parameters.
You went
here.
your way, and I went mine. Drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by. And all these dreams, they seem like a blur. Just like a blur. Running out of time, running out of reasons, running out of money. Don't know what I was thinking.
Okay, and this is true to the original, where when you change certain parameters, it will, it will stop the audio for a little bit. So certain things you can automate, other things you can't. A unique one here, and this comes in the shape. Um, Here is the shape and the spread. The spread is not a width control because you have a separate width control over here. And the width control is sort of a unique thing because it's not like, stereo, to mono. It goes through a bunch of different variations of settings where it will invert the phase of the left and right, reverse the left and right, all kinds of different variations. So it's not just a simple like width, like wider, narrower type of control. It's a little more sophisticated than that, so you have to kind of play with it a little bit to get through all of the options with it. The shape is kind of an interesting thing here. If I move to a different shape here, you could see how it shifts the onset of reverb, which makes it not come up quite as fast. If I click on the button down at the bottom here, it's an undo. So you always have one layer of undo. So you could see how the reverb would come in faster, right? So that give you like a sharper thing. And then the spread also has some control. It looks like it does the same thing, but in reality, what it does is it sort of changes a bit of the envelope of it. So the shape, well, yeah, the shape changes the envelope. The spread sort of changes the contour of that. So it gives it a bit more, I don't know what other way to describe it other than character. Okay, but you think of spread, you think of widening something, and that's not what it's actually doing. But it is creating some variation in the way that you shape the attack curve of the reverb and the decay curve of the reverb. So it's a little bit more complicated. The stuff like the time is pretty straightforward. When you get into this, and that you have three basic reverb things. If I wanted more high frequency reverb, I could bring that in here.
You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
So here you can bring more body in the low end. And this is a big thing for what makes a reverb like this like so amazing, is that control over the low end reverb, which really brings in the body and depth, and to me what brings in all the characteristic size. And it's a matter of tailoring that right, so with the thin vocal you can get a whole lot more body out of it even with a shorter reverb time.
You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
So that gives you like a nice way to control the shape, the reverb decay at different frequency areas. So you have that. The size ends up being very important in terms of the size of the space, so that will change the reverb time. It doesn't always do that with all parameters, but that's also true to the original. Filters are just high pass, low pass filters that you could put in. I'm not going to spend too much time with that. Here you can modulate the end, but really where they modulate the actual reverb itself. But probably the better way that most of that is done is with the diffusion controls and the decay optimization. In the original unit, you can select what channel, left or right, that you're applying the decay optimization. All you're doing is you're kind of shifting the way that side is varied. So it's usually, what will happen is the input signal comes in, and it will respond to the input signal and create some variation in the reverb between the left and the right signal. And so it's sort of complicated the way the algorithm works. I don't totally understand it, so I won't butcher it and try to explain it. But quite often when you get a reverb that basically sounds good, you can get a lot of extra character out of it just by playing with this. So it defaults to 7 reverb, but I'll go through some of the options here.
You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
So in this case, most of those seem a little bit more subtle. Let me go here. Maybe if I increase the reverb time, some of that may become a little bit more apparent. All right, and go back to there.
You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur.
Right, so you can hear the the subtle variations. If you put in the full context of the mix and you start playing with that, one of them will really stand out. That's ends up being the one that you will end up using. There's also an effect one, which switches over. We get to that and go through. The effect is a little bit more different because it separates the left and right a little bit more.
You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line. And all these cars are passing me by, and all these dreams, they seem like a blur. You went your way, and I went mine, drifting slowly down the road, and walking the line.
Again, depending upon the program, it'll be more or less like bigger effect. There's so many different things to get into with this. It's an incredibly sophisticated program, and if I go on for hours and hours going through all the different programs and different ways that you could use it, but it's really just like an amazing sounding reverb still. To this day, and I thought Relab has done an amazing job of capturing the essence of what this is all about, the character of what this is all about, and there's a lot to it. Even when you dig into the manual here of the plugin itself, it's pretty long, and the original manual of the 480L just is like hundreds of pages. As you go through, it goes through every single program, what the settings are, what each parameter does. So it's such a detailed study. But even if you just start with presets and working with presets, you'll find just like amazing results that come up very quickly. And then you have the ability to really go in and super detail them. So it's an amazing one, a crazy unit, but a real marker in terms of the history of digital audio. Like it still stands to this day as like an amazing unit for creating reverb. Like the work that Lexicon did for them really stands out above practically everything else in terms of digital reverb at that time. But it really became the professional standard very quickly, like as soon as it came out, and you would find it in every studio. So nice job by Relab. That was obviously was done a while ago. This is not a new one, but one that's worth looking at or digging out and wiping off the dust on if you have it in your plugin collection and digging into it again, because it's really worthwhile. Mixing with my plugin of the week, Relab Development LX480 Reverb.